Hello, everyone. So, today is our 21st podcast, and as a follow up from our last podcast, today we will talk about project based learning, but now as a home team, in order to theorize some concepts and in order to bring decades of experience with this particular approach. So, rather than focusing on the experiences which I have had, or Lala may have had, or maybe other people who may join us later on, I might just talk to a person
The experiences which I have had, or Lala may have had, or maybe other people
who actually
who may join us later on.
invented for
I might
me
just
project based learning, and that was Andrew. For me, Andrew was just the matrix of project based learning. And I have seen Andrew doing project based learning in the 90s. And in fact, once he became a professor of languages and chair in Bond University, he kept being asked by University of Queensland to run intensive courses in French. Andrew used to be teacher of French at the University of Queensland, and he did it brilliantly. So I'm not sure, Andrew, whether back then, when you were doing project-based learning, why everybody else, because I did French in your department of languages, where you actually were part, of which you were a part. I did French, and we were memorizing a textbook. I still remember that one text at least. The rest just flew out of my mind, out of my head. So I memorized all these texts in French. I was really good at that. And then I had a friend in Paris, and I wanted to tell him that I'm learning French and I'm already speaking a bit and I'm doing really well with my degree. And so I dialed the number from Australia. I tried to call him and I couldn't say a word. I was a high distinction student of French. I've memorized all the texts which were in the textbook. And I simply couldn't say, Hi, I'm studying French. I'm really good at it. And I really enjoy it. And I hope I will speak to you in French one day. I just couldn't say the simplest sentence on the planet. So, Andrew, if you can give us some sort of historical background for a few minutes about how you stumbled on the concept of project based learning. Is it something that you invented, or something that came to you, fell on your lap, or something you heard? I mean, a lot of our viewers are new to English language teaching, and for a lot of our lecturers at universities and school teachers, project based learning is like a new thing. But I've heard of it 30 years ago. You've heard it. I mean, your publications on macro simulation, which is what you used to call it, go to back to the 80s. So it's not a new thing. It's not a new drama, but it is still new in so many ways. So could you take us a little bit through the history, at least from your perspective, how you stumbled on it and how you worked with it?
Okay, good morning. Hello, everybody. It's an interesting question, and the answer is often the same for most of the questions that are asked of me particular in this particular context, which is, how do you create an environment for students to be able to develop at a personal level in ways which are interesting to them, in other words, that are motivating, without having to go through the misery of the motivation process, which we are going through now and have been going through for more than 40 years. And meet their real needs. And by needs, I want to emphasize once again that I'm not talking about needs that you can identify through what we normally call a needs analysis, which is some kind of survey where you say to people, what do you want to do? How do you want to do it? Do you want to be able to read newspapers? Do you want to be able to have conversations with your friends and so on? By need, I mean something that I've written about recently in a paper on rhizomatic learning. By need, I mean something like the moment-to-moment problems that people encounter as they are trying to deal with the production of whatever it is that they're trying to do. It doesn't have to be about language, by the way. This is a general model. It doesn't have to be about language. And language does not have a special status in the learning process, in my head at least. Although we may argue that there is a faculty of language which is particularly human or something like that. So the idea was, how do you create an environment where interaction will occur, which is similar to that of real life? But of course, in the classroom situation that I was in at the time, the real life situation was never exactly lifelike. I mean, it wasn't real life. It was a bit like real life, or a lot like real life.
So
And we didn't want to call it.
we're talking about the context where the internet wasn't there, the video wasn't
Yes,
there. So we're in Australia,
the video
20,000
was there.
kilometers from France. What do you do?
That's right. Well, what we did in those days, which was uh, the mid 80s, the mid 1980s, so that's 40 years ago. By the way, 1983 was a special year. Exactly 40 years ago, it was a special year because it marked the beginning of modern computer-assisted language learning. It was the beginning of it with the creation of a journal called Calico. Calico happened in 1983, which was kind of interesting, and it was one of the important moments. But it doesn't mean that computers were everywhere, because they were nowhere. There was no international video. There was local video, and there were a few satellites zipping around above us, and we could from time to time connect to them and download stuff. But in general, we were
And
isolated in Australia.
yeah, could you please tell us, because we're making a leap, which I think that is significant to many of our listeners, which is, you know, when I met you, I wasn't doing anything real life. In fact, I thought it was ludicrous to ask me to show to my students of German language videos with German people speaking. I mean, why did I need live German people recorded on the video showing? Why did I need to show them to my students in Australia when I could read a text for my students and make them memorize the text? Why did they have to see real people speaking? I mean, I did that not because I thought it was intelligent advice. Obviously, I didn't think that. I was too arrogant. But I just did that as well. We will see what happens. You have to have some openness about you. If you are an intellectual, you can't be locked. But Andrew, why were you interested in real life as opposed to just reading them French textbook?
Well, because real life, of course. Sorry,
Pierre and Mireille.
Pierre Mireille. Well, that's what we had at the time. We had Pierre Mireille. We had textbooks. We had characters in the textbooks. They fell in love and they got married and so on. But the important thing or the important progress from the perspective of language teaching is that we suddenly understood that language was not about words and grammar. It was not about simply memorizing text. It was about connecting culture to the things that we normally call language. It was about connecting gesture as well. And so the connection between gesture and language initially was about authenticity, was about how people talk to each other. But in reality, it went beyond that. And in the kinds of intellectual frameworks that I was working with, It also created a coordination between spoken language and movement. And that brought up the idea that language learning went beyond speech, went beyond words and grammar, but was actually a whole body a manifestation. And so we connected words with grammar, with gesture, and everything else that went with it. And what went with it was, of course, highly cultural. So, for example, I mean, it's a simple example of something that I did in an interview, and I still do it with my students. I go around the room shaking hands, right? Ding, how do you shake hands in French? And I was shaking hands with people. And the handshake, and then I would ask the students the question, actually, I did this in an interview for a professorship. And I asked the people, what did I just do? And they said, oh, well, you just showed us how to shake hands or how to greet people. But actually, I wasn't doing that. What I was actually doing was, well, three things. Yes, I did show them how to greet people. I showed them the rhythms of French people in action. And I also used my body to imprint on their bodies those rhythms. So the French people shake hands all the time. And so we just go ding, 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 ding. That's the rhythm of French handshakes. It's not, hello, how are you? It's good to see you. I haven't seen you for such a long time. And you put your other hand on top of the other. It's none of that. It's just ding, 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 ding. And that is actually, it's very important. People don't see that as important. It is very important because it reflects the general rhythms of French language and French culture. Okay, and so those three things. So those three things happen.
Nothing more irritating when there are jarring breaks in the conversation, like the rhythm is wrong, everything else is wrong, and the words are wrong, and everything is out of beat. It's kind of like putting people off. So the more you can reduce those, the better.
Right, and people will say, no, well, we don't care anymore. I want to be me. David Crystal says, oh, I want to be me. I don't really want to be Spanish when I speak Spanish. And that's fair enough. I can understand that. But the reality is he's going to lose something by not being more Spanish. People are going to lose something by not being more French or more, I don't know, competent English speakers. They're going to lose something. It's not just a question of saying, oh, yeah, I want to be me and I don't care if I look like an idiot.
Right, Andrew, I think that a lot of people are waiting for grammar and vocabulary, but I think what people don't understand, that you can live in Australia for 40 years and you still will not get your grammar and vocabulary right, but you could be a professor here because all other things will work. And those minute things can get corrected. You can always ask Microsoft Word to correct your grammar, but you cannot ask Microsoft Word to correct your presence in English.
That's correct. Yeah, and nowadays, of course, with ChatGPT,
fixes everything.
You fix everything that is fixable which is not you. Right? I mean, what I mean is your presence. You were talking about, and that's a critically important thing. Your presence, and your presence is the thing that makes the difference. It's not whether you speak, you say nice words, or whether you say good words, or whether you don't make mistakes, or whether you sound British, and so on. It is actually how you, as a communicator, function in relation to other people. And that is part of the things that we learn in complex environments. Okay? Now, and by complex environments, I include project-based learning. I don't like the term project-based learning particularly, but I think it's something that people understand or believe they understand intuitively. We'll give them a project. My daughter did projects 50 years ago when she went to school, or 40 years ago. And this was a big breakthrough in those days. Oh, we're going to have a project on how to bake cakes, how to bake Australian cakes. All right, well, so we did a project on how to bake Australian cakes. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about projects in a much bigger sense. And I think one of the things that we tend to forget about projects, when we talk about projects and other things, is we forget the big framework in which we generate and exploit the projects. In other words, it's not just saying, oh, well, we're going to have a class next Friday and it looks like this and like that. And by the way, we're doing a project next week. It is actually about changing the mindsets of people so that people start thinking in broader, bigger ways and start to understand that projects, even the little projects, by the way, enable students to find points of interest and find points of difference between themselves and whatever it is that they're trying to learn, and also find points of difficulty that they need to solve.
Right. So
the
difficulties come from the students' interaction with whatever problem they want to they need to resolve.
So they need to solve.
Not create. Right. So it's 25 students. There's 25 problems. Right. As opposed to. So one of the
actually it's 25 students. It's 500 problems.
Yeah. So one of the things you used to say when I watched you teach in coursework masters, preparing students for higher degree, what you used to say to people, and I will actually come back to this point, so that audience actually doesn't look only at the concept of can you come up with a better word than project, Andrew? Macro simulation was a very good word. So macro project, not micro project, but macro project, big. So you used to teach people to theorize or frame the reasons for going one way, not another. And I've had discussions with a number of people. Just recently, I submitted a paper for publication. So, and also my student just submitted PhD now from Borneo. So one of the things that you always ask, so not just what is learning, which we barely get a real response to, but also what is language, which is what you are now basically. And then obviously in the 90s or in the 80s, I think, or 90s, I forgot the references by now, but we started getting these, what I think of now as pedestrian definitions of communicative competence, pedestrian because they were just an explanation way poorer than ChatGPT would produce and not theorized in relation to other texts. So consequently, rather than expanding the intellectual framing of a field, it was just using intuitive words. Communication is like functioning in real world. There's communicative, sociolinguistic competence, knowing when to say what to say. Like my mother can invent it. It wasn't theorized. So I think you all, the concept of moving from words and grammar and text in the textbook, of moving towards those macro projects, macro simulation engagement of students, was also pushed by a conceptual shift, as you were saying. Language is not just those micro elements. Language is something else. And we will come back to it.
Well, we will come back to it, but I think that the question of what is, and you asked the question last time we had a meeting here or somewhere else with Huang, the issue of what is language as a definable object is extraordinarily complex. It is, in some ways we can go back to the old definition of language, which was called the system of systems, and we can now say it's a semiotic system of semiotic systems.
But it is
Uh,
continues to be externalized because the definition is produced by the linguist. But if you actually see that your English, say, let's assume you're a native speaker of English, and say, let's my neighbor who was born in Australia and his or her English, they probably different Englishes, right? For many
correct,
good reasons. And I think
correct,
that we often forget it, that language is like a skin. We all have it, we just have it differently.
correct. And
So
all of our languages are different. I mean,
and maybe my
each of us. What I mean by that is that each of us has a different conceptualization, internal conceptualization of what we call language.
because
And
of different experiences in our history, right? Like our
that's
skin. You
that's
have a
right.
different
That's right.
skin than me. You had a different ancestry. My experiences and my engagement with English was different. So, for example, in academic context, I am excellent. But if you put me into American ghetto and you try me to understand, I mean, there are great comedians on the internet that I don't listen to. It's just too hard. It's just not my culture, not my history. I find it really hard to even hear the words. Forget about understanding. I don't hear them. So it's not my skin in some sense, you could say it,
That's
right?
right.
Because I have an
That's right.
ancestor. So
But
the
the
idea
point
of
is that even those people who think that they speak the same language do not speak the same language
sure.
at a very precise level, right? I mean, even if they feel that they are very similar, they are not. And the reason for this, and we forget this constantly, uh, is that everything that we work with and live with is inferred from our interactions with the world. It's not, we do not, this idea of giving information, sharing information, producing knowledge is not correct. Everything that we do is at the interface between our minds and our bodies. And that interface is mediated by semiotic systems because that's all we've got. So that our minds, we have, just to go back to the simple idea, we have an idea, we want to express it. Our ideas are complex and multidimensional. We don't actually know what they are, but I want to tell you what is in my head. The only way I can do it is to rely on my body, which is as a kind of purveyor of the semiotic system, which I will take my idea and I will try to represent it using the limitations, not the richness, but the limitations of semiotic systems. Semiotic systems are necessarily limited because they are rule bound. You cannot avoid that. And so there is already between my mind and the semiotic system, there is an impoverishment of my thought. My thought, when I express it, the expression of my thought is less rich than my initial thought. And that's because of the limitations of the semiotic system or systems that I'm using. And then
Right. So
I produce the stream of signals, and then I lose control over it. I know I've said this before, but I'll say it again. Then I lose control over those signals because they go into your ears and other people's ears, and somebody makes sense of them in some way. And sometimes the sense that these people make is similar to the sense that I had in my head when I put it together and sent you the representation of the signal.
right,
Sorry, the
but
representation of the idea.
so basically, as you were teaching at the Queenstown University before you moved to Bond and elsewhere, so basically there were intellectual shifts happening among academics. We've understood that language is not externalized systems, that language is yours and yours only, and you interact with other people, but you develop your muscle. No, you don't acquire the muscle, you develop your muscle that you've constructed, however, for whatever needs and through whatever limitations you might have had and through whatever advantages. So the idea about something like a macro project, or what you were calling in your publication macro simulation, was to open up spaces for people like a gym. Go there and build up your muscle the way you need it, the way that it works for you, the way that you feel power now flows to you. I'm not here as a teacher to show you how stupid you are. I am here giving you the gym, the equipment, and now make yourself look the way it works for you. And
Yes.
what I will assess whether you developed yourself on an informed basis, or as opposed to, well, you decided that what works for you is to reciting the same two words, then it's not necessarily the level that we provide here at this university, because we want you to be a smart person and acting smart, not acting like a clown, right? So that was kind of, if I can make it as reductionist, there was a shift. But how did the concept of this macro task or macro simulation fall into your lap? Was it because you worked with, what was her name, and the French woman, and then you wrote your macro simulation paper? Did it come from, did you get it from America? Did you actually invent it in your department? How did it happen?
It was invented by Christine Mest uh, uh, in 1981 or 82 or 83, something like that. 1983, as I said, was a good year. She created that as a way of giving people opportunities. I thought it was a brilliant move on her part. I mean, she created it as a way of giving people a chance to put language and culture and information together uh, by recreating a French village um, in the classroom or in the university. And she invited me to work with her, and I thought that was a great idea. And we worked and we developed it together after that. And she and I uh, had a set of constraints. Well, what was the simulation? What's the macro simulation? Macro simulation is very simple. You have a a restricted space, right? You have um, a village, you have a company, you have I don't know a university, and within that space, you have people interacting with each other.
So that's very important.
And the only and sorry, so, yeah, the constraint's
The
very important.
constraint is very
And the
important. So can I just explain it? So there is this lecture by Professor Jordan Peterson, and he talks about constraints. So in order to exemplify how constraint is important for us to act, we can't act without a constraint, right? So
right,
I act within the constraints of our society, of the situation, of the rules that I understand, not that apply, but I understand apply. So he asked a student to come and, you know, to stand up in front of him, and he says, and Professor Jordan says to the student, so let's play. And then he says, you start. And the student doesn't know what to do, right? Because Peterson didn't set up any constraints of the game. So the student didn't know how to play because there were no constraints. So the constraint is important. So there was a French village. Constraints apply to the way you exist in a French village.
correct. And there was one more important constraint, which was the participants promised or undertook to keep the situation going, to keep the simulation going in a natural way. So the question that people had in their heads all the time is, so what happens next in real life? What happens, or in this village? What happens next? So that was the second constraint. And then there was a trigger that was generated. And the trigger was some controversial situation.
You didn't invent the controversial situation. Students came up because they were humorous. They thought, okay, we've got space to act. So what could be controversial in a French village? And that's how how it sort of got started.
Well, one of the things that happened before that is that they were also responsible for creating the French village. So the question is, so what do you find in a French village? Well, I mean, in terms of buildings, in terms of geography, in terms of organization of space. Well, every French village has, or typically, a French village has a railway station. It has a square next to the railway station. It has a church on the village square. It may have a fountain. It may have a cemetery not far away. It will have a coffee shop, a cafe at the railway station or near the railway station. It was typically, it's called the Café de la Gare, which is the railway station coffee shop. And it had a bakery, and it had a grocery, and it had a this, and it had a library, it had a school, and it had a pharmacy. So everybody had to work out. Well, first of all, they had to work out what a French village looks like. So that was some research that they could do, and that gave you insights into French culture, into a kind of historical approach to French culture, because many people these days don't live in villages, but they all know what a French village looks like. They all have this as part of their background. They carry this everywhere with them. Their villages are always with them in some sense. So they did that. And then they had to find jobs, yes, but also names and roles. And so, because our students were also heavily influenced by the people who were teaching them in the department, and the people who were teaching them in the department were humorous people, they participated. I mean, French culture is typically sarcastic and ironic and parodic. In other words, you do parodies of things very often. So a lot of the stuff that they came up with was a kind of parody of real life. Now, the advantage of a parody of real life is that it is a reflection of real life. In fact, you have to understand real life in order to be able to create a parody of it. And so our students, because they were a bit naughty, created a lot of people who were priests, Catholic priests, and they created a number of prostitutes as well, which was not what we had expected.
It wasn't planned.
It wasn't planned. You see, there was no curriculum. It just happened that way. And so the question then was, well, how is this going to work? But they made it work. Because one of the triggers was that somebody was seen jumping out of the window of a prostitute in the middle of the night, and this person was the mayor of the village, and then there was a big scandal. And what do you do in a village as opposed to a town, when you want to deal with a scandal? And because we didn't have the internet in those days, people wrote to the local newspaper, so we had to have a newspaper, and we had to have people managing the newspaper, and they published the letter in the newspaper anonymously, and then there was a court case, and then there were elections to replace the mayor that had been thrown out, and so on. But the point was that the number of functions and notions and topics and situations that were generated by this simulation was huge. It wasn't just chapter 3, ecology, chapter 4, job seeking, chapter 5, I don't know, cakes in Paris. It wasn't that at all. It was all of that plus all of this other stuff. that came out spontaneously. Now, it's also true. Well, what happened? Okay, so what did we discover? We discovered that the language that people were producing was much richer than the language that they had produced before. We discovered that sometimes it wasn't quite as grammatically correct as some of the stuff that other people had produced, but that would solve itself over time. And we also discovered that they were more socially and people talk about collaborative learning. I mean, this really was collaborative learning, but not in the sense of let's sit down, the three of us together, and we will collaborate. You know more than we do. Please tell us what you know, and if we know more than you do, we will tell you what we know. It's not how it worked. That wasn't what I've just described. Is not collaborative learning. What happened in the simulation was collaborative learning because everybody was caught in the situation. Other things that happened, which was kind of interesting, is that people began to identify with their characters because the roles that they took were not, it wasn't a role play. It wasn't something like pretend you're in a coffee shop. What do you say?
For
Oh,
five
I'll have three
minutes, right?
coffees, please. Yeah, for 5 minutes. I'll have two coffees and a croissant. Oh, okay. Thank you very much. See you later. It wasn't like that. This was roles that they had and kept and grew into over time, like over 15 weeks or 12 weeks or whatever the semester was. And they started to identify because, okay, so we actually had phases to this. One phase was the simulation itself. One phase was a kind of a review of and all of this was videotaped. We had a video camera, very primitive video camera, but it was there. And we used to videotape these things. And then students would look at their performances. And everybody looked at everybody's performances and would say, hey, this didn't work, that didn't work, this worked, this was good, this wasn't good, and so on. And so that kind of collaborative learning also was interesting because they were able to see what other people were doing. They were able to compare themselves with other people. They were able to see where they were strong, where they were weak, and sometimes other people gave them solutions to their problems.
So it didn't exclude points of structure, whether it's a
No.
language structure. But I remember I attended one of your classes. I wish I attended more of them. I think I was just too young, a little bit arrogant. I don't know. I was too caught up in my own work. You should never do that. Like I have students sometimes, not my PhD students, but whatever. I see people that they appreciate me, but they would not come to my class. So you get so caught up in your own thing and you're not actually learning the whole story. So, and that was lovely. And I remember you pulled out from different performances of students. You created a class where you were actually pulling out the shared elements which were problems. So when in classes when you took the center stage was when you actually shared particular aspects. You discuss particular aspects that were typical of the students. So I still remember two of them. I remember, first of all, recognition of a voice. That really got me, because what was a female voice in French, or even it's in English as well, I would identify as male and it was still female. So that's something like recognition of a voice. It's very important, especially if you listen to the radio or something, or podcast. And the other thing that I still remember, that how you introduce people at the meeting. So like you have a television setting, like a podcast, like here you have an interview, or if you are a news reader, a news anchor, and then you introduce someone else who will now talk about the story that happened, say, in Brisbane last night. How in French you do it. So in English you say the name of the journalist first, and in French you say it last. So it goes like that. You introduce Pierre Mireille, which is
Right.
right at the end. So you were introducing the structural aspects of the
Right.
of which was important, but then also students could have done and had access to drills, grammages, some more focused things if they wanted to work on, and so on. So nobody was stopping them, but it was important that they didn't. Um, when can you mute yourself, please?
Oh, sorry.
So what was important was that whatever they were learning was relevant to the problems they were experiencing for and during the macro
Right.
simulations
Right.
engagements.
But there was no obligation on my part to intervene. I just chose to do it because, for the sake of time and so on, that was the only way of doing that. Had it been a broader, lengthier, more intense kind of simulation over a bigger period of time, they would have been able to fix some of those problems themselves. And I think that's what I meant when we were talking. What we were doing back 40 years ago was what we today would call rhizomatic learning, or what today in Sugata Mitra's terms we would call self-organizing learning environments. And what's interesting is that we were doing it 40 years ago, and rhizomatic learning is relatively more recent in theoretical terms, not in terms of its present, in theoretical terms, and also independently. It's kind of interesting because there's a convergence going on at the moment between rhizomatic learnings, project-based learning, self-organizing learning environments. And I'm glad to see Wang here. Hello, Wang. Nice to see you. Because he took up one of the terms that I had talked about and we had talked about before, which was a day on French television. One of my favorite things, one of my favorite simulations was, or projects, call it whatever you like, was create a day on French television. And so Wang went and did it at Nova College in Vietnam. And maybe he'll have a few words to say in a minute. But what I would like to say about all of these environments is that they're big environments. They do not have a prescribed path through them. They ask just general questions such as create a day on French television, or in Sugata Mitra's terms, what is molecular biology? So big terms like that. People say, "Oh, how can you do that? How can you have a project based? How can you have a project based on something which is so broad, and with the students who know nothing and who are not independent?" And people worry about that. They say, "Oh, I have to help my students. I have to be there for my students. I have to organize my students."
My students
Right?
expect it from me. My students, I'm culturally disabled. Unless
My
I give
students,
it
that's
to
right.
them, they have some brains, like Western
That's right.
brains are
That's right.
open. Our students are mentally disabled. Now, first of all, give me a proof and that they mentally
Well, they are not.
disabled.
Well, they're
And
not mentally disabled, and you don't have to have a Western brain. There is no such thing as a Western brain or an Eastern brain. We just have brains. And the interesting thing about all of that is that, okay, and yes, it's true. And I've heard this from friends of ours who say, well, in Vietnam, my students expect me to teach them things, to tell them things, to help them, to be there for them. And somehow, if I'm not there, it's going to be a catastrophe for them, and they will fail, and so on. Not true. Okay, not true. In Thailand, people think the same. I'm sure in Indonesia, people think the same. Not true. The reality is that if people are interested in what they are doing, and one of the things about project-based learning, or things like project-based learning, is that you generate your own interest. And the other thing that happens in these kinds of situations is that, in general, people are successful in what they're trying to achieve, at whatever level of achievement that is. It doesn't have to be, I am like, a native speaker. I know I'm not supposed to say native speaker anymore. Forgive me, but but I am like a native speaker. You don't have to be like that. You have to be achieving at a level that makes you happy that you have achieved what you wanted to achieve.
And the role of a teacher is to help you to see things which you can, is to help
Which you
you,
cannot see.
yeah, not necessarily
And so,
teach you, but enable you to actually explore more so that you can see
correct,
that there is some wall that you're hitting, in fact,
correct.
that the response
But
in
quite
reality
often
is not what you expect.
you feel that you are hitting a wall. You feel it. I don't have to tell you. I don't have to be there to
That's right.
tell you that. You know that you've hit a wall, and then you get help. Now, in 2023, as opposed to 1983, 40 years ago, we now have the internet. We now have, online videos, databases, and this and that and that and that, which you didn't have then. And by the way, that kind of learning is called resource-based learning, and that kind of learning is actually also called blended learning. So just in case people think that blended learning is new, it ain't new. It's it's always been around, always, thousands of years of it,
I
just
have
that
a
it takes
feeling
different forms.
I have a feeling that when we interact with lecturers who think that Asian students are incapable of being independent, I think what the problem really is that the lecturer is giving up on themselves, and they are not able to actually take on a leadership role in making the process happen. And they
There's
also so that fear that they will fail because of their own lack of uh, leadership capacity of enabling this to break down, and also not trusting the students. So that's another thing.
not trusting the students, B, the students saying that they want the teacher to teach them and making the teacher feel responsible, C, the teachers being made to feel responsible by the administration, and D, a fear of of um, being I was going to say inadequate. It's not about being inadequate. It's a fear that they will not be, that they will, the teachers fear that they will lose face because they are seen somehow to create chaos instead of creating order.
And yet, when I was looking at data which was sent to me from Indonesia, not from Lala, not whatever, completely different island, um, when teachers were teaching on Zoom, during COVID, the problem that they expressed was the conversations in English in Zoom were difficult. I wasn't sure whether they heard me and understood me. I couldn't understand the students, and we had to speak English, because if I don't speak English, how will they hear English? They will never hear English. I am the source. Like God is the source, not you. Trust me. So that's the first point, right? And they're not going to learn it
The,
from you. They're going to learn it from resources, not from you.
right, that's right.
Like you only have one, and especially during COVID, you only had 20 minutes with the students. How could you even expect they will learn from you, right? So we need to
But yeah,
help people shift a little bit from that I'm the source of everything. You're not the source of
that,
everything. You are
that's right.
support.
I'd like Wang to talk a little bit about his experiment in a minute. But
Yeah,
before we do that, hello,
yeah,
are you
continue.
there? So I've
Yeah.
lost your picture. I don't know where your picture's gone.
Don't worry, it's the Thai connection. It's all good, Andrew. Continue.
Okay, I got you back.
Sounds good,
Um,
Andrew.
what I wanted to say is that there has been, over the years, there has been a lot of suspicion about things like technology and so on, and resource-based learning and so on. Two things have happened. COVID happened. That is a key factor in the whole process. And now ChatGPT has happened. So now the world has literally moved on to something entirely new. I think. I think it has, well, not entirely new, but it is now ready to undertake things that it was never ready to undertake 30 years ago. I remember when I went to the University of Canberra in 1998. That was my first year at the University of Canberra. People were saying, "Oh, well, we have to start working with technology in learning," and people were saying, "Oh no, don't." can't trust the technology to do any of this stuff. And so we finished up with 20% of people wanting technology and 80% of people hating technology. And that was not a good mix, because that's not the formula for progress. But now everybody loves technology as a result of COVID. Well, everybody, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people are now ready to use technology. Let me rephrase that. They're not ready to use technology. They say that they are ready to use technology. That's not the same thing, because I don't think we know how to use technology properly yet, but maybe we will one day. And then ChatGPT, of course, changes that and makes it available to everybody. And it's the democratization of the technology that is changing the world. We now have a world population which expects personalization in education, which expects rhizomatic approaches to learning. By rhizomatic, I mean unstructured and needs driven. Right? When you, the stupid example I always give is, you want to fix a printer. What do? You go to YouTube and you ask, how do I fix my printer? And you fix your printer. And you do it your own way, because you've got this kind of printer and this kind of problem, and you'll find other examples online.
So if I can
So
just...
we expect personalization. The world expects personalization, but education doesn't. Education has the problem of making sure that the personalization, that it's high quality stuff.
I have to disagree with you, Andrew. Do you
Just
think
wait, Quang. Just wait 1 second. I'll give you the voice now, but I just wanted to finish Andrew's point, because Andrew spoke for quite a while. So I just finish it. To summarize it, I also wanted to say that technology is here, but the key aspect of, let's call it macro simulation or resource-based learning, that you were engaged in and kind of invented together with, what was her name again? I keep forgetting. What was her name?
Christine Mestre. Christine Mestre, M-E-S-T-R-E.
Right.
She's never written anything else since then, but it was a good stuff that she wrote when she wrote.
The winning card of those projects was exactly what students love, which is socialization. I mean, socialization was huge, and divided sometimes in less groups, smaller groups, larger groups. Sometimes alone you were working as well, but social aspect was very strong. So it's not that Andrew is advocating some autistic model of teaching where you sit in front of a computer and just type. In fact, all these Andrew's type resource-based learning, macro simulations, and so on were about, had a very strong key component, which was socialization. I would like Quang. So I have now two other people to engage. So Quang, I would like you to talk, to make the point, whatever point you wanted to make, slowly and clearly. And secondly, I wanted you to make, because the internet is funny, and I wanted you to make also share with us your experiences from the macro simulations that you were running, and I suspect it was in French. I'm not so sure. And then I have a question for Lala, but he doesn't expect. There is some final noise coming from you. I don't know what it is. All right.
Okay, I have to disagree with Andrew on this one. First, the point that he made, he said that the world now wants to personalize things, and they like personalizations. They welcome personalizations. Andrew, do you think that is the truth? I mean, is that what is really happening?
Well, why do you think it? Why do you think? Just a minute. Why do you think it isn't happening? I mean, we all go around. We all go around, well, because when we have problems, we go and we consult people. Well, we don't consult people so much anymore. We consult Google, we consult ChatGPT, and so on. And the solutions that are found are solutions that suit us, and to that extent, they're personalized.
Yes. We like things to be personalized, and we like to do things in a personalized way. But I don't think the society welcomes personalizations. They say so. They say so. They say they like personalization, but they still maintain discipline. They want to
They still
maintain
Yes.
discipline.
maintain what?
That is the problem. They may
Sorry?
say
Really,
that they
that's
like
that's
personalizations.
what
Yes. Yes. They say that they like personalizations, and they say that they can provide you with personalization, like Google, like Facebook. They say that they will provide you with personalizations, but actually, no. They try to discipline things. They try to make regulations. They try to get regulate the world, just like education
Yes,
thousands of
yes,
years
yes,
before.
yes, yes. Well, maybe, but insidiously, and that's where the point is. It's insidious. It goes underneath your will.
Yes,
Insidiously, you
yes,
now have become free in a way that you were never free before.
yes.
And to that extent, personalization happens. Now, it may well be true that people say, "Oh, I want more regulation. Social justice has to be regulated. If I don't regulate the way you treat, you know, black people or Asian people or white people, yeah, of course, we never do anything about white people, but we although we talk about regulation, the reality is that we are freer than we have ever been before. And therefore, we are insidiously, in the sense that almost unknowingly, we become more and more personalized. And even in the classroom, we have rules about this and that and that and that. But the kids, when they go home and they check Chat GPT or they check Google or they check something else, are free to do it and
The
find
problem,
their solutions.
well, because I'm not an ethicologist, I do not study ethics, but the problem with educations, as I mentioned in many of my articles and many of my writing, and even sometimes you say that I should not provoke people aggressions, right? But actually, what we have right now, right here, is the fact democracy and a very staged system, which we say that we welcome personalization and we welcome students to be creative and inventive, but actually, it is totally opposite what we are trying to say. And well, and
But that's
even
not okay. But that's not what I'm talking about. You're talking about the yeah, administrative rules and stuff like that. I'm talking about individual people. Individual
no,
people
actually,
are
actually within. I mean, yes, of course, like you and me and Anya and Lala, we may think different from the people outside. But actually, do you think that they instinctively do not like personalization? Like we have discussion with last time with Anderson, right? And I even sent some of my articles to some international journals, prestigious journals, and the same answer that I received from them is that we should teach students somehow, and we should not allow them to freely do whatever they think it is possible to help them improve their learning. And I even sent an email to the editors of the journals saying that even though you disagree with me giving the student the freedom, I will still continue on this path. The problem
but
is
nobody
that,
cares.
yes, the problem is nobody cares. And within themselves, within their mind, even though they say that they would like to democratize the world, they would like to give student freedom, and we've been talking many years about autonomic cities and agency in the classroom, but actually do they do that? I don't think so. So it was a little bit, it was a little bit, you know, paradoxically to say that we welcome personalization. No, I don't
I
think
think
so.
we welcome personalization in our daily lives, is what I'm trying to say. And I think we
Um,
do. We do use. Well, of
even
course you do.
we even
Okay. So, for the sake of this podcast, can you tell us your experience with the macro
okay,
simulation?
okay. I will share a screen if I can. Let me see. Okay. Let me share a screen.
I don't think we disagree, by the way, while you're doing
Well, I just, I don't know. How can I say that? I just feel like, I don't know, maybe, wow. Well, I lost my hope. I mean, I don't trust the way people think about it anymore. And anyway, this is a pilot study because this is going to be replicate, and even I will make it to be a larger study in my PhD program. But well, actually, it is a pilot study in Vietnam Innova College, and we have two classes. Um, who studied with project based, and it was not a day on a French television, but it was a day on an English television, because most of my student was in A1 level, and they have to learn English so that they can meet the requirements, so that they can get out of school and graduate. So we have two groups, each group with 30 students. And well, I was quite brave because um, the first group was teacher led, which means that they was led by a teacher, and the teacher like go to school and teach them and say, okay, so this week we will do this, and this week we will do, and next week we will do another thing, so that I can help you with your project, because they after the course they will have to create a 30 minutes to 55 minutes or 60 minutes videos, resembling a day in an English television. And the other group, they work by themselves. Of course, they are guaranteed that whenever they ask for support, there would be a consultant or even a teacher to help them, and are given they were given the resources that are necessary on demand. So so one group, one class with teacher, another group without teacher, basically like that. Okay, so, and can you guess? So, which group? So, we assess different things. First of all, we assess the student speaking proficiency. Speaking proficiency after the course, and the course lasted 10 weeks. So, first of all, we assess their proficiency, speaking proficiency, and also we assess their autonomic city, which group become more autonomous, which group like believe in themselves more, trust that they can finish the project by themselves. And also, the problem with us using project-based learning is that people don't usually assess the project. They just think that it whenever I asked people, so what is a project, and they say, okay, just any give them something to do, and then they can learn something. And I ask them, so what was the difference between a project and a task? And they say, okay, they keep silent, they cannot differentiate between a task and a project. So basically, here I assess the project outcome, based on their, I mean, the accuracy of the language they use in the project. I also assess the creativity, which group was more creative with a project. Because, like, for example, on a television, and you have different kind of programs, right? And we can assess the creativity of the student by looking at the project. And can you guess, Anya? Can you guess which group was which group performed better in terms of the outcome?
Are you
Anna?
saying are you saying you had a control and experimental group? I can tell you that from on the basis of everything I've ever seen, including my doctoral students' work, it's always the experimental group, the resource, rhizomatic, macrosimulation groups, uh, whatever. They always outperform significantly anybody
No,
doing anything in the traditional way every time.
no. Actually, the outcome was this one. The experimental group, the group without a teacher, performed exactly the same in terms of accuracy with the with the control group, with the experimental group, which means that both groups create the same outcomes.
That's good
The
enough.
level of accuracy in the video are the same. Why? Because from their reflection, they say that they have more time to revise and to work at home. So basically, they produce the same kind of accuracy, the same level of accuracy. Which group was more fluent? What do you think?
I still say experimental.
And I say both group was as fluent as each other by analyzing the phrase that they use. In the outcomes, both group are as fluent as the other. Of course, they're not very fluent in English because they're just like A1 student doing the project, but they performed exactly the same in terms of fluency. And after the result, after the course, both group jump from A1 to A2 in terms of speaking proficiency. Now, now this is interesting because actually, if you look at this one, you will say, okay, so with a teacher or without a teacher, it's okay, right? Both could perform the same, have the same outcomes. But when I ask them, basically in the interviews, the time on task, and they say, and they said that for the teacher-led group, the group with the teacher, they have to spend like 3 or 4 or 5 weeks with a teacher, working with the teacher, and then they start to do their project in the next 5 weeks, which means that they used up all the 10 weeks that I gave them to finish the project. But for the second group, the group without a teacher, they did not need to consult anyone. They did not need to ask permission from anyone. They just started discussing and working with each other, and they only need 5 weeks to finish the project. Which means that first of all, the group without a teacher was more economical because they did not need to pay. We did not need to pay for the teacher, right? To lead them, to teach them in the class, and they was they saved time, and they saved time in finishing the project. So it means that even though the two projects produce the same outcomes, basically the same outcomes, the group without a teacher finish faster, need less time.
Okay,
And
but what was your role? I mean, if they were without the teacher, there was a role that you played, right? There had to be a role of the teacher somewhere. It's not like they sat down and looked at each other and English happened.
yeah, they look at each other and English happens. Now, the role of the teacher in my research was a consultant. It means that when they cannot settle down the issues, for example, they argue too fiercely with each other, and they need me to support them in terms of keeping the discipline. They will call me like, Wang, now I disagree with this member of the group, and can you help me because we cannot work on this one? But or actually, they did not ever ask me for grammar points or vocabulary. They did not ask me such things because they have ChatGPT and they did everything online. They even no, they even work without my support actually in 5 weeks. But they do ask me for several times about how to help keep the members in the group like discipline or how can they solve conflicts. And that was the time when I used my authority, but actually, they only asked me like one or twice in the whole project.
So
And
we had problems, personal problems in Konkan when we were running Tinius network, but we didn't have a punitive solution. We actually worked on students' culture, which is we created a constraint whereby students with each other came to terms and solve their own I mean, they pushed the personal issues aside because, say, by Sunday they had to publish something, and
yes, yes,
the whole community in Konkan knew that by, say, Sunday they will go on the computer and they are expecting an article from every group. if your group was quarreling instead of working, the whole community would know that you didn't do the work.
Yes, yes, and well, they have to put aside their quarrels, and they have to collaborate. But there was one student in the group who did not collaborate with his friends in the group without teacher control. And in the reflection, actually, he wrote something like this: I did not collaborate with them, not because that I don't like the course or not because I didn't like my friends, but it was because I had depression, and I'm very sorry for not
So that's
supporting my
different.
group.
So that's
Yeah,
different.
that is the different issues. They had conflicts because of personal issues rather than agreeing or disagreeing on the outcome. Yes, they usually disagree with each other, but they have to move with the flow of the project so that they meet the deadlines.
Gwen,
And
can I ask you, because we're almost coming to the end, can I
mm,
ask you, so that was one day on on English television. Did you have 60 minutes? Did you have debates? Did you have political arguments? What did you
ah
have? What did the students
and
create?
and what well the group without a teacher was more autonomous and more creative. From answering the questionnaire, they say that they had more freedom, and by analyzing the content of the video, you see that not actually a group but a class, and there are several groups within the class with the teacher, and several group with several projects with the group without a teacher. And basically, when you look at the videos that a student produced in the group with a teacher, most of the videos follows the same author. It was almost the same. But the group without a teacher, they went to the zoo. They pretended that they were a zoologist. They have a cooking show, the culinary art shows. They touch yoga. They say that, oh, well, to be honest, because I was not very fluent in English. So I think that by creating a video teaching yoga, well, I know I would do more different things on the video and put on different acts rather than have to report the news all the time. And they
Okay.
even yeah, so they were
So
more
let me
creative in
yeah.
buttons.
So let me just make a couple of comments, which I think are important. In formal terms, so maybe I don't know whether one group was more fluent than the other, but one of the issues that you've raised is what does fluency mean? Because let's leave that for a moment. Which group was more autonomous? Well, the experimental group was more autonomous. Which group had more variety in what they were doing? Well, the more autonomous group had more variety, so that the outcome was richer for the group that was independent. That's not nothing.
Yeah.
That's one thing. The second thing is which they actually did it in less time. Well, that's not nothing also. How did their proficiency level improve? The problem with proficiency is that it is very formalized. So you can say, oh, well, it was about the same level. Maybe, maybe not. And how you judge A1, A2. And at A1, A2 levels, it's very hard to make judgments anyway. I think it's pretty tough. So uh, the net balance, you see, the net balance, especially when there is such a thing as no significant difference, is not in the outcome that you were measuring, but in the outcomes that were next to what you were measuring. The fact that there was no teacher, or that there was no permanent teacher, meant that there was saving. Not, and I'm not saying just in terms of money. I mean, yes, money too, but also saving in terms of time, in terms of convenience, uh,
Yeah,
and inconvenience. Um, the idea that you don't have to wait for someone to come and help you, and so on. All of these things, you just do your thing, and so they perform better with better outcomes in terms of variety, in terms of range of stuff in less time and at lower cost. Well, that's not bad
Now, yeah,
in terms of outcomes.
I would like to ask some.
And it would be interesting to see, you know, how one could expand that with perhaps stronger resources or better resources.
Yeah,
Because I think again you had limited resources, right? I mean, I don't think you had a
I would like
huge.
to ask something. Well, I presented this pilot study in some conference, and there was one or two teachers there who asked me like, if you know that a class, of course, a class without teacher will be more autonomous because they were given more freedom, and of course, by given no freedom, they are more creative in language learning and presenting the outcomes. So you are being biased. Well, basically, I was just smiling when those teachers asked such question. But I would like to say something.
Biased about what?
Yeah, the problem is that if you know that something work, I mean, if you know that there is a method that can help your student to be more autonomous, and a method that can make them creative, why do you keep a blind eye on such method and saying
Well,
that by doing the traditional thing you will be autonomous, right?
okay, so let me
You're
stop this
ignoring the
here.
truth.
Let me stop the conversation here,
Okay.
and basically say, I want to say one thing, and then I want to ask Dr. Lala about something. So first, I
Hmm.
wanted to say is, if it is so obvious, why isn't it done everywhere? So that's the first thing, right? So, and secondly, my question to Dr. Lala um, is this resource-based, rhizomatic, micro-simulation type mega projects, macro projects, are they um, are they just a choice, or in fact, do you think that there is that any other way of teaching than this one is just bad pedagogy?
Yeah, very interesting. All right, Ania. I think what Quang has shared with us is very insightful. And yes, I believe that a successful project-based learning classroom relies on a culture of inquiry and creativity to ensure students engage in deeper learning driven by their curiosities. Once we have the results, however, we may not be encouraged to do the same thing. I think it's simply probably the culture of the society that does not promote the culture of encouraging newness as an asset or new ways of thinking, new ways of learning. Because what I have experienced, for example, when we are using project based learning, I feel like being trapped in the middle. I mean, I have to shift from the curriculum mapping and the standardization, and then I have to shift from that into a more flexible learning space, and then I have promote design thinking. And I feel that at the moment where Indonesian government is promoting the curriculum merdeka and project-based learning is actually one of the most important component in the curriculum. But then I checked the learning modules, I checked the textbooks. Well, it's actually, I mean, the macro simulation, the project based learning, and then uh, the intellectual framework is not there. We still pretty
That's
much
right.
use the very much traditional stuff like the chapters of the book are, let's say, written on topic by topic, which are segregated. And then we do not see any micro simulation in real life. So I think I'm working on that in particular at the moment, and I was not happy at all. So I think from this podcast, I learned a lot from the three of you. Well, we need to exercise more energy into shifting, from the standardization into a more flexible learning space. And what was the second question, Anya? I kind of forgot it.
Well, is doing something else than project-based learning or macro simulation style of teaching, is anything else bad pedagogy?
Mm.
Have you?
Well, uh, I prefer not to use project-based learning term. Actually, I prefer the word macro simulation. I don't know, project.
I called it. I
How did you
in
call
a
it?
recent publication I called it macro task.
Macro task. I think I prefer to use that
But
one. Yeah,
but
yeah.
it's not a good word because task, of course, connects to task-based learning.
Well,
Rather,
all
there's
of
Mm.
those
people like
concepts
that.
have been hijacked by other people already, so it's hard.
Right, right.
Well,
But
So,
okay, so just
right.
the reason why I'm asking you, because for me, maybe it's my mentality, maybe it's my whatever. For me, there's only good pedagogy and bad pedagogy. That's it.
Okay.
It's I'm totally black and white, right?
Right,
So
right, right.
there's only two pedagogies, good one and bad one. And I can defend it. And I have a feeling that people who don't do project-based learning, they cannot defend their pedagogy in
Mm,
any
mm.
other way than some conspicuous, intuitive terminology that they couldn't explain in any theoretical way.
well,
Right,
well,
right.
actually, Anna, um, I and Andrew and some people out there, we support micro simulations or project based learning, because I think that this can maximize the knowledge that student learn from our perspective, from our look. But actually, that is not the only thing. Language learning is not just about doing tests and doing projects. Like Doc Me LT, some articles I wrote a few years before. You just sit there and have a conversation with your student, not really a teacher, but two friends can speak English with each other, or you can speak English with someone else. Just sit there and speak English, and then your English can somehow improve if you really together work on something or discuss on something, and you can learn the language from the natural world. But whether the effect is significant enough is another story. But I don't think that project based learning is the only way to learn English. And the world is not just only education is not just about pedagogy. We have andragogy and things like that. We have self-study and teaching adults and different things, different methods. Like me and Andrew, or
No, but
I learn English from you, Andrew, but it does not mean that I'm doing a task, a project with you. I just speak English with you, and sometimes you figure out something and you give me feedback, and I learn from that. I don't know.
and
This is
what's
not
that
the
called?
only thing. Yeah, the
Well,
dog me.
what's that called? I mean, well, the reality is that you can think of it as a kind of task-based, or not task-based, as a kind of
Project.
project-based thing. Everything that we do in one sense is project-based. And that's why I don't like the term project-based. I mean,
Yeah.
I
No,
prefer terms like
but I
I prefer
totally disagree
terms like
with the functional crib. I mean,
sorry.
yeah, I totally disagree with functional crib. We cannot say that something is everything, Andrew. Not
Okay, so
everything is project-based, right?
so I wanted
But
you
you
to also
but you can't say that everything is rhizomatic.
Yes,
yeah.
yes, we can say so.
So, and that's
Yeah,
what
So
we're
and that's what we're talking about. So when you learn from me, and you say something like you said something strange today, autonomaticity or something, when it should have been autonomy.
consider.
If I had corrected you then, that would have been a kind of example
A
of,
task.
of, of rhizomatic system at work.
Yes,
But the
a
point is that
task.
life is rhizomatic.
Yeah,
The more I think of it, the more I believe that it is quite like that, and that to formalize it into project-based learning or macro simulation, these are just excuses for for generating interactions which will lead to some form of learning.
right. So if we're looking at the international curricula, so this is not the curriculum, this is extrapolation from the curriculum of the principles that come out from EFL curriculum in Indonesia, produced by Professor Widodo. And if you and working with the curriculum, it doesn't mean you pick one item and you say, I will be doing neat today. That's not working with the curriculum. To work with the curriculum, you have to work with every aspect of it at once. So you have to have exploratory, engaging learning through observation, questioning, exploring, experimenting. It has to involve critical, interdisciplinary sort of form of engagements. You have to have a student centeredness. You have to have interactivity. All of that. You cannot do it in an exercise which says, repeat after me. Right? It doesn't exist in it. You need to throw people on a deep end for them, and obviously have access to resources and each other, for them to actually engage with all these outcomes that are specified, or characteristics or features of a modern pedagogy identified by Professor Widodo. So I wanted to insert this slide into our conversation. So we need to actually say that we're not for people who are inventing future, sitting on the cutting edge, while everybody else is in Middle Ages exactly where they should be, right? Today is not in Middle Ages. Today is here on this slide. We've spoken about language. So if you're telling me that working with a textbook and section chapter by chapter, that's we're just repeating and doing questions to the textbook, that means teaching language, I would like that particular scholar to tell me what is language and where did they get it from. We've discussed it in the beginning of the podcast, so I'm not going to elaborate on this definition, just flagging it. But exactly, not everybody has the same amount of being. That's Bourdieu, right? So what we're doing, we're opening spaces through our classes of English for students to acquire more being, right? So through English, they expand their context of participation in this world by doing a simple thing like macro simulation and learning and analyzing and making fun of, reproducing things like debates on Australian television or advertisements, French advertisements, because, French television or English television has a specific sequence, and now they analyze it, see how they could uh, appropriate it to their own, to suit their own interpretation of that French or Australian or any other television, right? So these are empowering, enabling people to actually expand their context of participation. So when they right, so I have produced some more text here just for evidence. Yes, Andrew.
I did want to say something about repeat after me. It depends what the repeat after me context is.
Yeah, I'm not
Because
talking about audiolingual. I was talking about audiolingualism, or I was talking about how you make people memorize the textbook so that they, get the high distinction.
Right. But what I'm saying is that there are some, let's call them remedial, particularly remedial contexts where, or if you don't like the word remedial, you can kind of awareness raising contexts where you can, you do repeat after me.
Right, but it is not about repetition. It's about stimulating reorganization, which is your exercises,
Yes.
right? So that's a completely different.
Yes.
So right, so we need to actually hear why we're doing what we're doing. So this is from a study in which I participated. So we're working with the curriculum. The student is aware that they have to teach critical thinking, literacy, and so on. But the definitions of it, critical inquiry is about inquiring about the visual. Sir, what is this? Sir, I don't really know whether critical thinking is about inquiring about visuals. Literacy, it's an act of observing or reading class materials. Where do people get these definitions from? Collaboration, doing diets. Andrew, how are you? Now you ask me how I am back.
That's the definitions. The definitions are adaptations of textbook approaches, not textbook necessarily, specific
but something
textbook,
like
but
that.
of habitual use of. It's about making the things we have been doing for the last 20 years look like they are up to date.
Right. So we can be patting ourselves on our shoulders and saying, "Oh, poor us. We're only from Asia. We're only from Latin America. We're only from blah." It's only to be expected that we just do that. Um, yeah. So, and then comes Quang's research and the critique he got. Oh, we all know that. Well, so then why don't you do that? If you all know it, that it works, are you working against the students? So yeah, so that's what I wanted to share, just to summarize a few things and just to put a text,
Well,
include the text in our podcast so that people can
just for fun, that if my research really works, I mean, really becomes popular, then there would be no pedagogy anymore. Because
Right.
pedagogy is teaching
Pedagogy is
students, right?
basically pedagogy is chapter 3 of your thesis, right? Tell us about theorize your role and tell us what you did as a result.
Did nothing.
Yeah, but you have to
Yeah.
explain why, right? So you can't write your thesis without chapter 3, or at least in Australia, it's chapter 3, which is explain to us your role to justify what the heck you did or you
Or
didn't do.
stopping them from killing each other. The conflicts get out of control.
So,
Anyway, yeah.
but that's quite interesting. It's a very interesting outcome. That that pedagogy is under attack. I don't think learning is under attack. Maybe pedagogy is under attack, but learning is not under attack. And I think the whole issue is, how do you tap into students' learning processes at a personal level in order to be able to move forward? Because in the end, that's what has to happen. But there was a point I wanted to make. I've forgotten now. Wang, it was about you, and then somebody said something and disappeared. Sorry. Okay, never mind.
All right, my friends, so I will finish for today. We've been here at it for 1.5 hours. So thank you very much, whoever has seen us participate here with us, and whoever will see us in the future. So we will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you so much, and thank you, our home team.
Thank
Okay,
you.
bye bye.